The air was thick with the scent of candle wax and incense, but something else lingered in the small, dimly lit church on that cold November night in 1994. A presence that made the shadows twist unnaturally against the stained glass windows. In the quiet town of Mill Haven, Indiana, Father Daniel Hargrove knelt before the altar, his hands trembling, not from prayer, but from the weight of a confession he would never live to share. His whispered words, barely audible, were cut short by a single chilling sound, a low, guttural hum that seemed to rise from the earth itself, vibrating through the pews. When the congregation found him hours later, his body was slumped forward, his eyes wide open, frozen in an expression of terror so profound it seemed he had glimpsed something no human mind was meant to comprehend. The official report called it a heart attack, but the strange symbols scratched into the wooden floor beneath him, invisible to all but the most curious eyes, told a different story, one that would unravel the fragile boundary between faith and madness. What could drive a devoted priest, a man of unwavering conviction, to collapse in the sanctuary of his own church, his final moments marked by fear so intense it seemed to burn through his soul? What did Father Hargrove see in those final seconds that left his face a mask of horror, and why, decades later, do those who dare to speak of that night insist that the truth remains buried, not by time, but by something far more deliberate and sinister? This is not just a story of a single death. It's a descent into a psychiatric mystery that defies explanation, a case that challenges the limits of belief, the fragility of the human mind, and the very nature of reality itself. Tonight you're stepping into a dark tunnel, one that winds through the hidden corners of a small American town and into the depths of a religious enigma that has haunted investigators, psychologists, and believers alike. What you're about to hear will stir a storm of emotions, fear, intrigue, perhaps even a flicker of empathy for a man caught in a web of forces beyond his control. But be warned. The deeper we go, the more you'll question whether the human mind can truly withstand the weight of truths too vast, too unsettling, to be fully understood. Was Father Hargrove's death the result of a fractured psyche? Or did he uncover a secret so dangerous that it demanded his silence? Could it be that the answers lie not in the church but in the minds of those who survived that night? Minds that have never been the same since? This story will leave you with questions that cling like damp fog. What happens when faith collides with something older, darker than any scripture? How far can the human mind bend before it breaks under the strain of the unknown? And what if the truth about Mill Haven's lost priest is still out there, waiting for someone brave or reckless enough to find it? Stay with us until the end, because the revelations we're about to uncover will challenge everything you thought you knew about the line between devotion and delusion. Take a moment to reflect. This case isn't just about one man's descent into terror. It's a mirror held up to the fragility of our own beliefs, a reminder that even the most steadfast among us can be shaken by forces we cannot name. It's a story that asks us to confront how vulnerable we are when the boundaries of morality, sanity, and safety begin to blur. If you're ready to dive into this mystery, show your commitment to uncovering the truth. Hit that like button to ensure more people discover the dark corners of this story, and leave a comment below with the words, "I'm ready to discover the truth about this story." By doing so, you're joining a community of truth seekers, those who dare to look where others turn away, who want to understand what lies behind the veil of the inexplicable. Thank you for being here, for choosing to face the unknown with us. Prepare yourself, because what comes next contains a key revelation that will forever change the way you see the human mind. The morning after Father Daniel Hargrove's death, the small town of Mill Haven woke to a stillness that felt unnatural, as if the air itself held its breath. The church, usually a beacon of warmth with its glowing candles and soft hymns, stood silent, its doors locked by order of the local sheriff. Whispers spread among the townsfolk. Some said the priest had been ill, others murmured of something darker, something that didn't belong in a house of God. But it was Margaret Ellis, the church's elderly organist, who first noticed something out of place. While tidying the sacristy, her trembling hands brushed against a loose floorboard behind the altar. Beneath it, tucked into a hollowed-out space, she found a leather-bound journal, its pages worn and edges curling as if they'd been handled obsessively. The journal belonged to Father Hargrove, and its contents would soon cast a shadow over Mill Haven that no amount of prayer could dispel. Margaret, a woman whose faith had carried her through decades of loss, hesitated before opening the journal, she felt a chill. Not from the drafty church, but from a sense that whatever was written inside was meant to stay hidden. Yet curiosity, or perhaps something less innocent, compelled her to turn the first page. The entries began innocently enough: sermons, reflections on scripture, notes about parishioners' struggles. But as the dates progressed, spanning the summer and fall of 1994, the tone shifted. Father Hargrove's neat handwriting grew erratic, the words sprawling across the pages like a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. "They are watching," he wrote in one entry dated October 12th. "Not with eyes, but with something else. I feel them in the silence, in the spaces between prayers." Margaret's heart raced as she read, her fingers gripping the journal as if it might slip away and take the truth with it. The journal described a series of encounters that Father Hargrove could neither explain nor ignore. It began with a parishioner, a young woman named Clara Voss, who had come to him in late August, her face pale and her voice barely above a whisper. Clara, a devout member of the congregation, had always been quiet, her life marked by a devotion to the church that bordered on obsession. But in the weeks before Hargrove's death, she had changed. She spoke of dreams, vivid, relentless visions that came to her every night. In them, she stood in a vast empty field under a sky that pulsed with an unnatural light. Figures cloaked in shadow circled her, chanting in a language she didn't understand but felt in her bones. "They know me," she told Hargrove, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe. "They know things about me no one could know." Hargrove, trained to see such confessions as signs of spiritual crisis, tried to guide her back to faith. But Clara's words haunted him, burrowing into his mind like a splinter. As Margaret read deeper into the journal, she found entries that described Hargrove's growing unease. He wrote of hearing the same low hum Clara described, a sound that seemed to emanate from the church itself, growing louder when he was alone. He began to notice patterns. Objects in the church moved slightly, a crucifix tilted just off-center, a candle snuffed out before it should have burned down. He dismissed these as tricks of an overworked mind, but the journal revealed a man teetering on the edge of doubt. "Is it possible," he wrote on November 2nd, just days before his death, "that faith is not a shield, but a door? Have I opened something I cannot close?" The final entry, scrawled in a hand so unsteady it was barely legible, read, "Clara was right. They are here. They have always been here." Margaret closed the journal, her breath shallow. She knew she should take it to the sheriff or perhaps the bishop, but something stopped her. The symbols she'd glimpsed beneath the altar, crude and jagged, matched sketches Hargrove had drawn in the margins of his journal. Circles within circles, intersected by sharp angular lines that seemed to writhe on the page. They weren't random. They felt deliberate, ancient, as if they carried a weight that pressed against the mind. Margaret, a woman who had never questioned her faith, felt a flicker of doubt. Not in God, but in the safety of the world she thought she knew. She hid the journal in her coat and left the church, the weight of its secrets heavy on her shoulders. The discovery of the journal marked a turning point, though no one in Millhaven knew it yet. Clara Voss, who had vanished from town the day after Hargrove's death, became the subject of quiet speculation. Some said she'd run off, overwhelmed by grief. Others whispered that she'd been taken. By what, they wouldn't say. The sheriff's investigation was cursory, hampered by a lack of evidence and a town eager to move on. But for those who knew Hargrove, who had seen the change in him in those final weeks, the journal was a Pandora's box, its contents threatening to unravel the fragile peace of Millhaven. What had Clara seen in her dreams? Why had Hargrove, a man of God, begun to fear the very church he served? And what were the symbols etched in wood and ink that seemed to pulse with a life of their own? As the days passed, Margaret kept the journal hidden, unable to bring herself to destroy it or share it. She began to notice things, shadows that lingered too long in her peripheral vision, a faint hum in her ears when she passed the church. The town, too, seemed to shift. People spoke less, smiled less, as if the weight of Hargrove's death pressed against them all. The mystery was no longer just about a priest's death. It was about a community teetering on the edge of something vast and unknowable, a secret that had been buried long before 1994 and was now clawing its way to the surface. In the days following Father Hargrove's death, Millhaven's quiet streets buzzed with an undercurrent of unease, like the hum of a distant storm. The church remained closed, its heavy oak doors sealed with yellow tape, a stark contrast to the warm glow it once offered. The townsfolk, bound by habit and faith, gathered in small groups outside, whispering about the priest's final moments and the strange circumstances that surrounded them. But one name surfaced more than any other: Clara Voss. The young woman, once a familiar face in the pews, had vanished the morning after Hargrove's body was found. Her absence was a wound in the town's collective heart, a mystery that deepened the shadows cast by the journal Margaret Ellis now guarded in secret. Clara had always been an enigma in Millhaven. At 24, she carried herself with a quiet intensity, her dark eyes seeming to hold secrets she never shared. She was a regular at the church, volunteering for every event, from bake sales to midnight masses, her devotion almost feverish. But those who knew her best, her mother, Ellen, and a handful of close friends, noticed a change in her during the summer of 1994. She grew distant, her once warm smile replaced by a haunted expression. She spoke less, often staring into the distance as if listening to something no one else could hear. When pressed, she would only say she was tired, but her mother later confided to a neighbor that Clara had stopped sleeping, spending nights pacing her room or scribbling in a notebook she refused to show anyone. The last time anyone saw Clara was the evening of November 7, 1994, hours before Hargrove's death. She had been seen leaving the church after a private meeting with the priest, her coat pulled tightly around her despite the mild autumn air. A groundskeeper sweeping leaves near the church steps later told the sheriff he'd overheard Clara muttering to herself as she left, her words disjointed but urgent. "It's not a dream. It's real. They're waiting." He thought little of it at the time, assuming she was upset, perhaps grieving some personal loss. But when news of Hargrove's death spread and Clara failed to return home, those words took on a chilling weight. Her mother reported her missing the next day, but the sheriff's search yielded nothing. No trace of her car, no sightings at the bus station, no clues in her sparsely furnished apartment. The town's attention turned to Clara's life, searching for answers in the fragments she'd left behind. Her apartment, a small unit above the town's only bookstore, was eerily untouched. Her bed was made, her dishes washed, but a single detail stood out: a pile of torn paper in her trash bin, covered in the same strange symbols Margaret had found in Hargrove's journal. The sheriff, a pragmatic man named Tom Bradley, dismissed them as doodles, the product of a stressed mind. But those who saw the scraps, neighbors who'd peeked into the apartment during the search, felt a creeping unease. The symbols weren't random. They were precise, repetitive, as if drawn with a purpose that transcended conscious thought. One neighbor, a retired schoolteacher, swore she felt dizzy just looking at them, as if they pulled her gaze inward, toward something she couldn't name. Clara's mother, Ellen, was inconsolable. She insisted her daughter wasn't the type to run away. She was scared, Ellen told anyone who would listen, her voice cracking with desperation. She kept saying she saw things that weren't there. I thought she was just overwhelmed. I should have listened. Ellen recounted how Clara had visited Father Hargrove weekly, sometimes daily, in the months leading up to his death. She believed he was helping her daughter find peace, guiding her through what Ellen assumed was a spiritual crisis. But now, with Clara gone and Hargrove dead, Ellen began to wonder if the priest had known more than he let on. She begged the sheriff to investigate the church, to look into Hargrove's final days, but Bradley, wary of stirring up more panic in an already shaken town, refused to dig deeper without evidence. Meanwhile, Margaret Ellis wrestled with her own secret. The journal, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her attic, seemed to pulse with a life of its own. She hadn't opened it since that first night, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was calling to her, urging her to read more. Late at night, alone in her small house, she would hear faint sounds, a hum, like the one Hargrove described, or the creak of floorboards when no one was there. She told herself it was her imagination, the stress of keeping such a secret. But when she finally mustered the courage to revisit the journal, she found a passage she'd overlooked, written in Hargrove's frantic hand. Clara says they speak to her in the dreams. They know her sins, her fears, her desires. They know mine too. I tried to save her, but I fear I've only drawn them closer. The passage sent a chill through Margaret. She began to piece together a timeline, cross-referencing the journal's dates with Clara's visits to the church. Hargrove had been counseling her for months, but his entry suggested he was no longer just a spiritual guide. He was a co-conspirator in something he didn't fully understand. He wrote of rituals, small acts Clara insisted they performed to keep them at bay. These included lighting candles in specific patterns, reciting prayers backward, and tracing the symbols in the church's dust-covered corners. Hargrove admitted he humored her at first, believing it was a way to calm her troubled mind. But as the weeks passed, he began to feel their weight, as if each act tethered him to something ancient and unyielding. The town, unaware of the journal's existence, began to fracture under the weight of speculation. Some believed Clara had been possessed, her disappearance a sign of divine judgment. Others whispered of a cult hidden in Millhaven's quiet streets with Hargrove and Clara as its unwitting victims. A few, those who'd seen the symbols or heard the hum, spoke in hushed tones of something older, something that predated the church and the town itself. The sheriff, desperate to maintain order, dismissed these theories as hysteria. But even he couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. Clara's vanishing wasn't just a missing person case, it was a thread that, if pulled, threatened to unravel the town's very foundation. As November turned to December, Millhaven grew colder, not just in temperature but in spirit. The church remained closed, its windows dark, its steeple a silent sentinel over a town that no longer felt safe. Margaret, torn between fear and duty, began to wonder if Clara's disappearance was a warning, or a summons. The journal, with its cryptic warnings and strange symbols, held the key, but opening it again meant facing whatever had driven Hargrove to his death and Clara to vanish. And yet the hum persisted, faint but undeniable, echoing in the quiet moments when the world held its breath. As winter tightened its grip on Millhaven in December 1994, the town seemed to shrink under the weight of its unanswered questions. The disappearance of Clara Voss and the death of Father Hargrove hung over the community like a fog that refused to lift. The church, still cordoned off by sheriff's tape, had become a place to avoid, its once welcoming facade now a reminder of secrets too heavy to bear. Margaret Ellis, clutching the hidden journal, felt the town's unease mirrored in her own restless nights. The hum she'd begun to hear grew louder, more insistent, as if it were trying to speak. But it was the arrival of a stranger in Millhaven that stirred the town from its uneasy slumber, igniting new fears and unearthing whispers of a presence that had been watching all along. The stranger appeared on a snowy evening, stepping off a Greyhound bus at the edge of town. He was tall, gaunt, with a face half hidden by the brim of a worn fedora. His coat, too thin for the Indiana winter, hung loosely on his frame, and his eyes, sharp, unblinking, seemed to take in everything at once. He called himself Elias Kane, a private investigator hired by a distant relative of Clara Voss to find her. But his arrival felt less like a search for answers and more like the opening of a door that had been sealed for a reason. The townsfolk, already on edge, watched him with suspicion. He asked questions, too many, too pointed, about Clara, Hargrove, and the church. He lingered near the locked sanctuary, sketching in a small notebook, his movements deliberate, almost reverent. Margaret first encountered Elias at the diner on Main Street, where she'd gone to escape the oppressive silence of her home. He sat alone in a corner booth, his notebook open, his pencil tracing the same symbols she'd seen in Hargrove's journal. Her heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to approach, driven by a need to know if he was friend or foe. Elias was polite but guarded, his voice low and measured. He claimed to be following leads on Clara's disappearance, but his questions circled back to the church, its history, its congregation, and the strange events of November. When Margaret mentioned Hargrove's death, Elias's eyes narrowed and he asked almost too casually if she'd noticed anything unusual in the church before it was sealed. Her instinct was to lie to protect the journal's secrets, but something in his gaze, a flicker of knowing, made her wonder if he already sensed the truth. Elias's presence stirred unease in Millhaven, but it also brought buried memories to the surface. Older residents began to speak of the church's past, stories they'd long dismissed as folklore. The church, built in the 1850s, had been erected on land once used by a reclusive religious sect, a group that vanished under mysterious circumstances before the Civil War. Whispers of their practices, rituals conducted under starless skies, chants that echoed through the fields, had been passed down through generations, but most considered them tall tales. Now, with Elias poking into the town's history, Those stories felt less like myths and more like warnings. A retired farmer, too old to care about ridicule, told Elias of a night in his youth when he'd seen lights flickering in the church's basement, long after it should have been empty. He swore he heard voices not in English but in a tongue that made his skin crawl. Margaret, meanwhile, couldn't shake the feeling that Elias's arrival was no coincidence. She returned to the journal, driven by a mix of fear and compulsion. Hargrove's entries grew more desperate in the weeks before his death, describing meetings with Clara that left him shaken. "She speaks of a presence," he wrote on October 28th, "something that watches from the edges of the world. She says it knows us, all of us, and it waits for the right moment. I tried to dismiss her, but last night I saw it. A shadow in the vestry, taller than a man with no face. It didn't move, but I felt it watching. God help me, I think she's right." The entry ended abruptly, as if Hargrove had been interrupted. Below it he'd drawn another symbol, a spiral bisected by a jagged line, identical to those found beneath the altar. Elias's investigations led him to the same symbols. He spent hours at the county library, poring over records of Millhaven's founding. He uncovered references to the sect, known as the Order of the Silent Veil, a group shunned by early settlers for their unorthodox beliefs. Their leader, a man named Amos Creed, claimed to commune with entities he called the Watchers, beings that existed beyond the veil of human perception. The sect's rituals, documented in fragments of a burned journal, involved symbols eerily similar to those Hargrove and Clara had drawn. Elias shared this with Margaret in a hushed conversation outside the diner, his voice tinged with urgency. "These symbols aren't random," he said. "They're a language, a call." Hargrove and Clara stumbled onto something they weren't meant to find. The town began to notice Elias's effect. People reported strange occurrences, lights flickering in their homes, dreams of endless fields under pulsating skies, the same hum that had haunted Hargrove and now Margaret. The sheriff, growing frustrated with Elias's relentless questions, warned him to leave, but Elias refused, claiming he was close to finding Clara. He began visiting the church at night, slipping past the tape, though no one knew how. One groundskeeper swore he saw Elias standing motionless in the churchyard, staring at the steeple as if waiting for something to emerge. The next morning, fresh symbols were found etched into the church's outer walls, faint but unmistakable. Margaret's fear grew, but so did her resolve. She began to suspect that Elias knew more than he let on, that his arrival was tied to the journal, the symbols, and the hum that now followed her even in daylight. She confronted him one evening, showing him a page from the journal. His reaction was subtle but telling, a tightening of his jaw, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "You need to be careful," he told her. "This isn't just about Clara or Hargrove. It's about something that's been here longer than any of us." He refused to say more but left her with a warning. "Don't read the journal alone, and don't speak the words you find." As Elias's shadow loomed larger over Millhaven, the town's unease deepened. The church, once a symbol of refuge, now felt like a wound in the earth, bleeding secrets no one was prepared to face. Margaret, caught between fear and the need for answers, began to wonder if Clara was truly gone, or if she was still out there, drawn into the same darkness that had claimed Hargrove. The hum grew louder, the symbols more insistent, and Elias Kane, with his notebook and piercing gaze, seemed to be the key to unlocking it all, or unleashing it. By late December 1994, Millhaven was a town holding its breath, caught in a web of fear and suspicion that seemed to tighten with each passing day. The church, sealed and silent, loomed over the town like a gravestone, its locked doors unable to contain the growing unease that seeped into every home. Elias Kane's presence had stirred something in Millhaven, awakening memories and fears long buried. The hum, once a faint disturbance noticed only by a few, now seemed to linger in the air, a low vibration that set nerves on edge. Margaret Ellis, clutching Father Hargrove's journal like a talisman, felt the weight of its secrets growing heavier, its pages pulling her toward a truth she wasn't sure she wanted to face. But it was a discovery in the church's basement led by Elias that would push the town closer to the edge of the abyss. Elias had become a figure both feared and sought after in Millhaven. His late-night visits to the church, his cryptic warnings, and his relentless questions about Clara Voss and Father Hargrove made him a lightning rod for the town's anxieties. Yet some, desperate for answers, began to trust him. Margaret, Torn between her instincts and the need to understand, agreed to meet him one freezing night at the church's edge, where the shadows seemed to cling too tightly to the walls. Elias had found a way into the basement, a forgotten space beneath the sanctuary that hadn't been touched in decades. "There's something down there," he told her, his voice steady but laced with an urgency that made her skin prickle. "Something Hargrove and Clara found. I need you to see it." Against her better judgment, Margaret followed him, her flashlight cutting through the darkness as they slipped through a rusted side door. The basement was a labyrinth of damp stone and cobwebs, the air heavy with the smell of earth and decay. Elias led her to a corner where the floor had been disturbed, the dirt scraped away to reveal a stone slab etched with symbols, those same circles and jagged lines that haunted Hargrove's journal and Clara's torn papers. The slab was heavy, but Elias, with a strength that surprised Margaret, pried it open, revealing a shallow pit. Inside were remnants of rituals, melted candle stubs arranged in a spiral, scraps of paper with handwritten chants, and a small wooden box containing what looked like human hair, tied with a thread that shimmered unnaturally in the flashlight's beam. Margaret's breath caught. Some of the papers bore Clara's handwriting, others Hargrove's. The discovery was a jolt, a tangible link to the madness that had consumed the priest and the young woman. Elias explained what he'd pieced together from his research and Hargrove's journal, which Margaret had reluctantly shared in fragments. The symbols, the chants, the rituals, they were tied to the Order of the Silent Veil, the sect that had once claimed the land beneath the church. Their beliefs centered on the Watchers, entities they believed existed in a realm just beyond human perception, accessible only through specific rites. These rites, Elias said, were meant to open a door, to invite the Watchers into the world. "Hargrove and Clara didn't start this," he whispered, his eyes scanning the darkness as if expecting something to emerge. They stumbled into it. Clara's dreams, Hargrove's hum, they were being drawn in, used. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement's cold. She remembered Hargrove's journal entries about the rituals he and Clara performed, small acts to keep them at bay. But the evidence before her suggested something else. Those acts weren't protective. They were invitations, steps in a sequence that Hargrove hadn't fully understood. The chants, written in a mix of Latin and an older, unidentifiable language, were unlike any prayer Margaret knew. She refused to read them aloud, but even in silence, they seemed to hum in her mind, their rhythm echoing the sound that now followed her everywhere. Elias warned her not to touch the box, claiming the hair, likely Clara's, might carry a resonance tied to the rituals. Margaret didn't believe in such things, but the way the thread glinted, almost pulsing, made her keep her distance. Word of the basement discovery spread, though Margaret and Elias tried to keep it quiet. The sheriff, under pressure from the town, finally entered the church, but his search was cursory, dismissing the slab and its contents as relics of a forgotten prank. Yet the town's mood shifted. People began to report their own encounters with the hum, describing it as a voice without words, a pressure that seemed to press against their thoughts. Some claimed to see shadows moving in their homes, formless but deliberate, always just out of sight. A local teacher who'd been close to Clara found a symbol scratched into her front door one morning, identical to those in the church. She moved away within the week, refusing to speak of it. Margaret's nights grew sleepless, the journal now a constant presence in her thoughts. She began to notice patterns in Hargrove's entries, references to specific dates and times when the hum was strongest, always at night, under a new moon. She cross-referenced these with Clara's visits and found a chilling correlation. The rituals had intensified in the weeks before Hargrove's death, as if Clara and the priest were racing toward something, or being pulled. One entry, dated November 5th, described a dream Hargrove had shared with Clara. A field under a sky that pulsed with light, figures circling them, their faces obscured. "They want something," Hargrove wrote. "Not worship, not devotion, something deeper. I fear Clara knows what it is." Elias, meanwhile, grew more erratic. He spent hours in the church basement sketching the symbols, muttering to himself about patterns and cycles. He told Margaret he believed Clara was still alive, not physically in Millhaven, but somewhere else, caught in whatever the rituals had unleashed. His certainty unnerved her, as did his refusal to explain how he knew so much about the Order of the Silent Veil. When she pressed him, he only said, "I've seen this before. Not here, but elsewhere. It always starts the same way." His words left Margaret with a sinking feeling that Elias wasn't just investigating. He was part of the mystery, a piece of a puzzle that stretched far beyond Millhaven. The town's fear reached a fever pitch as Christmas approached, a holiday that felt hollow without the church's warmth. The hum was no longer a secret, it was a shared affliction, a sound that seemed to weave itself into the fabric of the town. Margaret, clutching the journal, began to wonder if the rituals had awakened something that couldn't be undone. The symbols, the chants, the hair, they were fragments of a larger design, one that Hargrove and Clara had only glimpsed. And Elias, with his shadowed eyes and relentless drive, seemed to be leading them all toward its heart whether they were ready or not. As Christmas Eve 1994 approached, Millhaven seemed to teeter on the edge of collapse, its once tight-knit community fraying under the strain of fear and unanswered questions. The church, still sealed, had become a forbidden place, its steeple casting a long shadow that seemed to darken the town's spirit. The hum, now a constant presence for many, pulsed like a heartbeat in the quiet moments, its rhythm syncing with the growing dread that gripped Millhaven. Margaret Ellis, haunted by Father Hargrove's journal and the discoveries in the church basement, felt as though she were being drawn into a current she couldn't escape. Elias Kane, the enigmatic stranger, was no longer just a seeker of truth. He was a catalyst, pushing the town toward a reckoning. And it was on the night of the new moon, December 28, 1994, that the next piece of the mystery would unfold, revealing a truth that would shake Millhaven to its core. Margaret had spent days poring over the journal, her eyes straining in the dim light of her attic. Hargrove's entries had grown increasingly frantic, his words a tangled mix of fear and fascination. He wrote of the new moon, a recurring motif in his notes, as a time when the veil is thinnest. Clara had told him the same, claiming her dreams were most vivid then, the figures in the field clearer, their whispers almost intelligible. Hargrove's final entries hinted at a plan, a final ritual he and Clara had intended to perform on the new moon to end it. But end what? The journal offered no answers, only a chilling warning. If we fail, it will not stop with us. Margaret, driven by a mix of duty and dread, shared this with Elias, who nodded as if he'd expected it. "The new moon," he said, his voice low. "That's when it happens, that's when they listen." Elias convinced Margaret to join him at the church that night, insisting they needed to understand what Hargrove and Clara had attempted. She hesitated, the memory of the basement's symbols and the strange box still vivid, but the hum, now a constant companion, urged her forward as if it were guiding her steps. They slipped into the church under cover of darkness, the new moon casting no light to betray them. The air inside was heavy, the silence broken only by the faint hum that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Elias led her to the altar, where the symbols Hargrove had scratched into the floor still lingered, their edges worn but unmistakable. He knelt, placing a candle in the center of the pattern, and began to whisper words from the journal, words Margaret recognized as the chants from the basement. The ritual was simple but unnerving. Elias arranged candles in a spiral, mirroring the pattern found below, and traced the symbols with a piece of chalk, his movements precise. Margaret watched, her heart pounding as he recited the chants, his voice low and rhythmic, the words twisting in the air like smoke. She wanted to stop him, to run, but the hum grew louder, filling her mind, drowning out her fear. The candles flickered, though there was no draft, and the shadows on the walls seemed to shift, stretching into shapes that were almost human but not quite. Elias's eyes were fixed on the altar, his face pale but resolute. "This is what they did," he said. "This is what opened the door." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a sound, not the hum, but a low, resonant tone, like a bell struck deep underground, filled the church. Margaret's knees buckled and she gripped a pew for support. The air grew thick, oppressive, as if the space around them had contracted. Elias continued chanting, his voice steady, but Margaret saw something in his eyes. Fear, or perhaps recognition. The symbols on the floor seemed to glow faintly, their lines pulsing in time with the tone. And then, in the corner of her vision, Margaret saw it. A shadow, taller than a man, its edges blurred, standing just beyond the candlelight. It didn't move, but she felt its attention, a weight that pressed against her mind, probing, searching. Panic surged, but before she could speak, Elias stopped chanting, his breath ragged. The tone faded, the shadows retreated, and the hum returned, softer now, almost soothing. "It's not enough," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They didn't finish it. Something's missing." He refused to explain further, but his hands trembled as he gathered the candles. Margaret, shaken to her core, demanded answers. Elias only shook his head. "Hargrove and Clara tried to close it," he said. "But they didn't know what they were dealing with, neither do we. Not yet." The night left Margaret changed. She began to dream of the field Clara had described, a vast expanse under a sky that pulsed with unnatural light. The figures were there circling her, their faces hidden but their presence suffocating. She woke each morning with the hum in her ears, louder now, and a sense that something was watching, waiting. The town, too, felt the ripple of that night. Reports of strange occurrences multiplied, lights in the church windows, whispers heard in empty rooms, symbols appearing on fences and trees. The sheriff, overwhelmed, called in a state investigator, but the official report attributed the disturbances to mass hysteria, a town grieving its priest and missing daughter. Elias, however, grew more determined. He spent hours in the library, cross-referencing the Order of the Silent Veil with obscure texts on ancient rituals. He found references to the Watchers in forgotten journals, describing them not as demons or gods, but as something else, entities that existed in the spaces between, drawn to human fear and devotion. The rituals, he told Margaret, were a way to bridge that gap, to invite their presence. But why? And why now? The answers, he believed, lay with Clara. "She's not gone," he insisted. "She's part of it. We need to find her before the next new moon." Margaret, torn between fear and the need to understand, began to see Elias in a new light. His knowledge of the rituals, his familiarity with the symbols, suggested a connection to the order that went beyond investigation. She found a crumpled photograph in his notebook, slipped out during one of their meetings. A young woman who looked eerily like Clara, standing in a field under a dark sky. When confronted, Elias's face darkened. "It's not what you think," he said, but offered no explanation. The hum, the symbols, the shadows, they were closing in, and Margaret realized that the truth about Clara, Hargrove, and the Watchers was far larger, far darker than she'd imagined. The new year of 1995 arrived in Millhaven like an unwelcome guest, its arrival marked not by celebration, but by a deepening sense of dread that clung to the town like frost. The church, still sealed, stood as a silent accusation, its dark windows reflecting the growing unease of a community unraveling. The hum, once a private affliction, had become a shared secret, a sound that haunted sleepless nights and whispered through the cracks of daily life. Margaret Ellis, now a reluctant keeper of Father Hargrove's journal, felt the weight of its secrets pulling her deeper into a mystery that seemed to stretch beyond the present, into a past that Millhaven had long tried to forget. Elias Kane, with his cryptic knowledge and relentless pursuit, was no longer just a stranger. He was a mirror, reflecting truths the town wasn't ready to face. And it was a discovery in the town's archives, unearthed in the cold days of January, that would reveal just how deep the roots of this mystery ran. Margaret's dreams had grown more vivid since the night of the new moon, each one pulling her back to the field under a pulsating sky, where shadowed figures watched with an intensity that left her breathless. The hum followed her into waking hours, a constant reminder of the ritual she and Elias had performed. She couldn't shake the image of the shadow in the church, its formless presence lingering in her mind like a bruise. Elias, meanwhile, had become consumed, spending days in the county library and nights prowling the church grounds. His notebook was filled with sketches of symbols, fragments of chants and notes about the Order of the Silent Veil. But it was a chance encounter with a retired librarian, Agnes Porter, that opened a new door into the past. Agnes, a frail woman in her 70s, had lived in Millhaven her entire life. She'd heard the whispers about the church, the stories of the order, but had dismissed them as folklore until Elias's questions stirred her memory. She remembered her grandfather, a town clerk in the early 1900s, speaking of a fire that had destroyed a barn on the church's land in 1872. The official report blamed a lightning strike, but her grandfather had hinted at something else, a deliberate act to erase evidence of the order's final days. Intrigued, Elias convinced Agnes to grant him access to the town's archives, a dusty collection of records stored in the basement of the town hall. Margaret, driven by a mix of fear and determination, joined him, the journal tucked safely in her coat. The archives were a labyrinth of crumbling papers and faded ledgers, but Elias moved with purpose as if guided by instinct. After hours of searching, he found a file labeled Millhaven Land Records, 1850-1880. Buried within was a document detailing the church's construction, including a map of the land it stood on. The map showed a network of underground chambers, long sealed beneath the church, chambers the order had used for their rituals. A handwritten note dated 1872 mentioned artifacts removed from the site after the fire, stored in a locked vault at the town hall. The note was signed by Amos Creed, the order's leader, and warned that the artifacts were not to be disturbed lest the Watchers return. The discovery sent a chill through Margaret. The chambers matched the location of the basement where she and Elias had found the ritual remnants. But the mention of artifacts was new, and Elias's reaction, his eyes lighting up with a mix of excitement and dread, confirmed her suspicion that he knew more than he'd shared. They searched the archives for the vault, finding it behind a rusted door in a forgotten corner. Inside was a single crate, its wood warped but intact. Elias pried it open, revealing a collection of objects that mirrored those in the church basement. Candles, scraps of paper with chants, and a small, intricately carved stone, its surface etched with the same symbols that haunted Hargrove's journal. The stone seemed to hum faintly when Margaret touched it, a sensation that made her pull back as if burned. Elias's voice was hushed as he explained what he'd pieced together. The Order of the Silent Veil believed the land beneath the church was a threshold, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. Their rituals, centered on the new moon, were meant to commune with the Watchers, entities they saw as guides to hidden knowledge. But something had gone wrong in 1872, leading to the fire and the Order's disappearance. Hargrove and Clara, Elias believed, had unknowingly restarted the cycle, their rituals in 1994 echoing those of the past. The stone, he said, was a key, a focal point for the rituals, its symbols a map to something beyond human understanding. They weren't just praying, he said. They were calling something, and it answered. Margaret's mind reeled. The journal had hinted at this, with Hargrove's references to a door and Clara's dreams of figures that knew her deepest fears. But the artifacts brought a new clarity and a new fear. The hum, the symbols, the shadows, they weren't random. They were part of a pattern, one that had been set in motion over a century ago. She thought of Clara, her disappearance now seeming less like a flight and more like a crossing, a step into whatever lay beyond the veil. Elias's insistence that Clara was still alive, somewhere else, took on a darker meaning. Was she lost or had she been chosen? The town, unaware of the archive's secrets, continued to fracture. The hum was now a topic of open discussion, with residents sharing stories of sleepless nights and unsettling dreams. A local pastor, brought in to bless the church, refused to enter after feeling a presence at the door. Symbols appeared in new places, carved into tree trunks, painted on barn walls, each one a reminder that the mystery was growing, spreading. The sheriff, under pressure, reopened the investigation into Clara's disappearance, but his focus remained on practical leads, ignoring the growing sense that something larger was at play. Margaret, haunted by the stone's hum and the journal's warnings, began to question Elias's motives. His knowledge of the order, his familiarity with the rituals, suggested a connection he refused to explain. The photograph of the woman who looked like Clara, found in his notebook, gnawed at her. When she confronted him, he deflected, saying only, "I've been chasing this for years. It's bigger than Millhaven. His words, meant to reassure, only deepened her unease. The hum grew louder, the dreams more vivid, and Margaret realized that the past wasn't just echoing, it was awakening, and she and Elias were standing at its heart. January 1995 dragged Millhaven into a deeper chill, not just from the biting Indiana winter, but from a pervasive fear that seemed to seep into the town's bones. The hum, now a constant companion for many, pulsed through the quiet moments, a reminder that something unseen was stirring. The church, still locked and avoided, had become a symbol of a wound that wouldn't heal, its shadow stretching across a community, unraveling under the weight of its secrets. Margaret Ellis, now bound to Father Hargrove's journal and the artifacts from the town's archives, felt as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice, the hum pulling her toward an abyss. Elias Kane, with his haunted eyes and cryptic knowledge, was no longer just a guide. He was a harbinger, and his actions in the days leading to the next new moon would push Millhaven past the point of no return. Margaret's dreams had become a nightly torment, each one dragging her back to the field under a sky that throbbed with unnatural light. The figures, once vague shadows, now had a presence so vivid she could feel their gaze, their whispers weaving through her thoughts like threads. She woke each morning with the hum in her ears, louder now, and a sense that the journal was no longer just a record. It was a map, leading her toward something she wasn't ready to face. Elias, meanwhile, had grown more secretive, his time split between the church and the archives. He carried the carved stone from the vault everywhere, claiming it was the key to understanding what Hargrove and Clara had unleashed. "It's not just a relic," he told Margaret one evening, his voice tight with urgency. "It's alive in a way. It holds the pattern." The new moon was approaching, January 27, 1995, and Elias was convinced it was their last chance to find Clara and stop whatever was growing in Millhaven. He believed the rituals Hargrove and Clara had performed were incomplete, leaving the door they'd opened ajar. "We need to finish it," he said, his eyes burning with a fervor that unnerved Margaret. "Not to call them, but to close it. If we don't, it'll spread." He refused to explain what it was, but the artifacts, the stone, the chants, the symbols pointed to something ancient, something that had been waiting in the land beneath the church for centuries. Margaret, torn between fear and a need to end the hum that haunted her, agreed to help, though her heart screamed to run. On the night of the new moon, they returned to the church, slipping past the sheriff's patrols under a sky blacker than any Margaret had ever seen. The air was heavy, the hum so loud it seemed to vibrate in her chest. Elias carried the stone and a notebook filled with the chants from the journal and the archives. They descended to the basement where the slab with its etched symbols waited. Elias arranged candles in the spiral pattern, placing the stone at its center. "This is what they did," he said, his voice steady but strained. "But they didn't know the final step. I do." Margaret's stomach twisted as he began to chant, his words a mix of Latin and the strange, guttural language from the order's texts. The symbols on the slab glowed faintly, their lines pulsing in time with the hum. As Elias chanted, the air grew thick, the temperature dropping until Margaret's breath clouded before her. The hum deepened, becoming a resonant tone that shook the walls. She felt a pressure in her mind, as if something were pressing against her thoughts, searching for a way in. The shadows in the basement shifted, coalescing into forms that were almost human but wrong, too tall, too fluid, their edges dissolving into the darkness. Margaret's heart raced, her hands trembling as she clutched the journal. "Elias, stop," she whispered, but he didn't hear her, his voice rising, the stone in his hands glowing with a sickly light. The tone grew louder, a sound that wasn't just heard but felt, a vibration that seemed to unravel the world. Then it happened. A crack, not of sound but of reality, a sensation like the air splitting open. The slab shuddered, dust rising in spirals, and the shadows solidified, their forms clearer now, their presence overwhelming. Margaret saw faces, not human but masks of intent, their eyes like voids that pulled at her soul. The hum became a voice, not in words but in feelings, fear, longing, knowledge too vast to hold. Elias's chanting faltered, his face pale, sweat beading on his brow. "Clara," he whispered as if answering a call only he could hear. And then, in the center of the spiral, a figure appeared. Not a shadow, but a woman, her face obscured, her body shimmering as if caught between worlds. Margaret's breath caught. It was Clara, or something wearing her form. The figure didn't move, but its presence filled the room, a weight that pressed against Margaret's mind. Elias dropped to his knees, the stone slipping from his hands, its glow fading. "We were wrong," he gasped. "It's not a door, it's a mirror." The figure vanished, the tone ceased, and the shadows retreated, leaving only silence. Margaret and Elias stumbled out of the church, the hum gone, but the memory of that presence burning in their minds. They didn't speak as they fled. The stone left behind, the candles snuffed out by an unseen force. The town woke the next morning to a changed Millhaven. The hum was gone, but so was the church's steeple, collapsed as if struck by an invisible force. The sheriff found no evidence of vandalism, only the symbols on the slab, now cracked in two. The townsfolk, unaware of the night's events, felt a shift, a lightness but also a void, as if something had been taken. Margaret, haunted by the figure in the basement, began to question what she'd seen. Was it Clara or something using her image? Elias, shaken to his core, admitted he'd been wrong. The rituals weren't about closing a door, they were about reflecting something back, showing the watchers what they wanted to see. The mystery deepened, the answers slipping further away. Elias, now a shell of his former self, prepared to leave Millhaven, but not before giving Margaret the photograph from his notebook. "Her name was Anna," he said, his voice hollow. "My sister. She disappeared 10 years ago in a town like this. I thought I could stop it." He left without another word, leaving Margaret with the journal, the stone, and a truth that felt too large to hold. The town, sensing the danger had passed, began to rebuild. But the scars remained, symbols that wouldn't fade, dreams that lingered, and a church that no one dared enter. The collapse of the church steeple in the early hours of January 28, 1995, marked a turning point for Millhaven, but not the kind that brought relief. The town, already battered by months of fear and uncertainty, woke to a scene that defied explanation. The steeple's jagged remains scattered across the churchyard, as if torn apart by an unseen hand. The hum that had plagued Millhaven was gone, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a presence in itself, pressing against the town's collective psyche. Margaret Ellis, still reeling from the night in the church basement, carried the weight of what she'd seen, the figure that might have been Clara, the shadows that weren't human, and Elias Kane's broken admission about his sister. The journal, now a constant companion, felt like a chain binding her to a truth she couldn't fully grasp. As winter deepened, Millhaven tried to move forward, but the silence hid a lingering dread, and Margaret knew the mystery was far from over. Elias left Millhaven the day after the new moon, his departure as abrupt as his arrival. He left behind the photograph of Anna, his sister, her face hauntingly similar to Clara's, and a warning. "Don't go back to the church. Not yet." Margaret wanted to heed him, to lock the journal away and forget the symbols, the stone, the chants. But the silence was worse than the hum. It was expectant, as if the town were holding its breath, waiting for the next act in a drama no one understood. The sheriff, under pressure from the townsfolk, declared the church unsafe and scheduled its demolition. But even he seemed uneasy, his reports vague about the steeple's collapse. The official story blamed structural failure, but those who'd seen the symbols on the slab, now cracked and buried under rubble, knew better. Margaret's dreams hadn't stopped. The field, the pulsating sky, the circling figures. They were clearer now, their whispers forming words she couldn't quite catch. Each dream left her more drained, as if something were siphoning her strength. She began to notice physical traces of the dreams, faint scratches on her arms mirroring the symbols appearing overnight. She hid them under long sleeves, afraid to admit what they might mean. The journal offered no comfort, its pages filled with Hargrove's descent into fear and Clara's cryptic warnings. One entry, dated November 6, 1994, stood out. "Clara says the Watchers don't want us, they want through us. They need a vessel, someone to carry their will. I fear she's offering herself." Margaret's heart sank. Had Clara known what she was doing? Had Hargrove? The town, meanwhile, tried to reclaim normalcy. The church was boarded up, its demolition delayed by bureaucratic red tape. But people avoided the area, crossing the street rather than pass its shadowed walls. Stories of the hum were replaced by tales of the silence. Moments when clocks seemed to stop, when conversations faltered as if interrupted by an unseen listener. A local baker claimed to have seen Clara's face in a dream, standing in the churchyard, her eyes empty but her mouth moving, forming words he couldn't hear. Others reported finding symbols in unexpected places, etched into frost on windows, drawn in the dirt of untouched fields. The town's pastor, still refusing to enter the church, held services in a community hall, but attendance dwindled. As if faith itself were fraying, Margaret, desperate for answers, turned to the archives again, hoping to uncover more about the Order of the Silent Veil. She found a letter, tucked into a forgotten ledger, written by a town elder in 1873, a year after the fire that ended the order. The letter described the aftermath. Members of the sect had vanished, but their artifacts, stones, chants, symbols were buried to keep the threshold closed. The elder warned that the land was marked, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, and that any disturbance could awaken what sleeps. The letter mentioned a ritual, performed every new moon for decades after the fire, to ensure the watchers remained dormant. The practice had died out by the early 1900s, forgotten until Hargrove and Clara stumbled into it. The realization hit Margaret like a blow. The rituals weren't just a call, but a balance, a way to keep something at bay. Hargrove and Clara, in their attempts to understand or control it, had disrupted that balance, reopening the threshold. The figure in the basement, the shadows, the hum, they were signs of a breach that hadn't fully closed. Margaret began to suspect that Clara hadn't vanished in the conventional sense. She was still here in some way, caught in the space between worlds. The photograph of Anna, Elias's sister, gnawed at her. Had Anna been a vessel too? Was Elias chasing the same force that had taken Clara, hoping to save or redeem what he'd lost? Driven by a mix of guilt and resolve, Margaret returned to the church alone, defying Elias's warning. The silence inside was suffocating, the air heavy with the memory of that night. The basement was as they'd left it, the slab still cracked, the stone gone. Elias must have taken it. But the symbols on the walls seemed to shift in the dim light, their lines forming patterns that tugged at her mind. She heard a whisper, not the hum but a voice, faint and familiar. "Clara?" she called, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the echo of her own words. But she felt watched, not by eyes but by something deeper, something that knew her fears, her doubts, her secrets. She fled. The journal clutched to her chest, but the encounter left her changed. The town, too, seemed to sense the shift. The silence grew heavier, the dreams more frequent, the symbols more persistent. A child found a stone in the churchyard, etched with the same spiral and jagged line, and fell ill within hours. Her fevered sleep filled with visions of a field. The sheriff, now openly rattled, called for outside help. But the state investigators found nothing. No evidence of foul play, no trace of Clara, no explanation for the steeple or the symbols. Millhaven was alone with its mystery, and Margaret, holding the journal, knew the truth was closer than anyone realized, hidden in the silence that now defined the town. February 1995 cloaked Millhaven in a quiet that was both oppressive and deceptive, a stillness that masked the undercurrent of dread flowing through its streets. The church, its steeple a shattered ruin, stood as a monument to the town's unraveling, its boarded-up windows hiding secrets that refused to stay buried. The silence that had replaced the hum was no comfort. It was a void, a space where something waited, watching. Margaret Ellis, now a reluctant guardian of Father Hargrove's journal, felt the weight of its pages like a stone in her chest, each word pulling her closer to a truth she feared would break her. The dreams of the field, the symbols appearing in frost and dirt, the whispers in the church. They were no longer just signs but threads in a tapestry that stretched back centuries, binding Clara, Hargrove, and now Margaret to an ancient force. As the next new moon loomed, the mystery reached its climax, forcing Margaret to confront the heart of what she'd uncovered. The town was fracturing under the strain. Families moved away, citing reasons that felt hollow, job offers, better schools, but their haunted eyes betrayed the truth. Those who stayed spoke in hushed tones of dreams that mirrored Margaret's, a field under a pulsing sky, figures that knew their deepest fears. The child who'd found the etched stone in the churchyard recovered but refused to speak, her parents locking their doors at night as if to keep out more than the cold. The sheriff, overwhelmed by the lack of answers, had taken to patrolling the church alone, his flashlight sweeping over symbols that seemed to multiply in the shadows. The state investigators had left, their reports dismissing Millhaven's troubles as collective delusion, but the townsfolk knew better. Something was awake, and it was no longer content to lurk in the background. Margaret's resolve hardened, driven by guilt over Clara's disappearance and Hargrove's death. The journal, now worn from her constant handling, offered fragments of clarity. Hargrove's final entries spoke of a mirror, a concept he'd struggled to understand. "Clara says it's not a door we opened," he wrote on November 7th, hours before his death. "It's a mirror reflecting what we carry inside. The Watchers see us, all of us, and they use what we give them. I fear I've given too much." The words echoed Elias's cryptic warning in the basement. "It's not a door, it's a mirror." Margaret began to piece it together. The rituals, the symbols, the stone, they weren't summoning the Watchers. They were amplifying something already present, reflecting the fears, doubts, and desires of those who performed them. Desperate for answers, Margaret tracked down Agnes Porter, the retired librarian who'd helped uncover the Order's history. Agnes, frail but sharp, shared a story her grandfather had told her about the Order's final days. After the 1872 fire, a single member survived, a woman who claimed the Watchers weren't gods but echoes, reflections of human consciousness given form. She'd warned that the rituals could turn the mirror inward, amplifying the darkest parts of the mind until they took on a life of their own. The woman had vanished, but her warning lingered buried in the archives until Margaret and Elias unearthed it. The realization was chilling. Clara's dreams, Hargrove's terror, the hum, they were manifestations of their own minds, twisted by the Order's rituals into something real, something that could act. Margaret's dreams grew more intense, the figures no longer content to watch. They spoke now, their voices a chorus of whispers that formed her name, her fears, her guilt over failing to help Clara. She woke one night to find a symbol scratched into her bedroom floor, its lines fresh as if drawn by an unseen hand. Panic drove her to the church, the journal in hand, determined to end the cycle. The new moon was hours away, and she felt its pull, a tide drawing her toward the basement. The slab, cracked from the last ritual, seemed to hum faintly, though the town claimed the hum was gone. She knelt, tracing the symbols, her fingers trembling. The air grew heavy, the silence splitting into that resonant tone from the night with Elias. As she read from the journal, reciting the chants Hargrove had copied, the symbols glowed, their light pulsing in time with her heartbeat. The shadows moved, forming a circle around her, their forms clearer now. Not Clara, not Hargrove, but reflections of herself, her doubts, her fears of being alone, of failing those she loved. The tone deepened and the figure appeared again, Clara or her echo, her face a mask of sorrow. "You see us," the figure whispered, its voice both Clara's and not. "You made us." Margaret realized the truth. The Watchers weren't external entities but projections fed by the rituals, given life by the minds they touched. Clara had offered herself not as a sacrifice but as a vessel, her devotion and fear shaping the force that had consumed her. Margaret stopped chanting, the journal falling from her hands. The figure flickered, the shadows retreating, but the tone lingered, a reminder that the mirror was still open. She fled the church, the silence returning, but it was different now, charged, expectant. The town felt it too. The symbols stopped appearing. The dreams faded for some, but a heaviness remained as if Millhaven were marked forever. The sheriff, finding Margaret outside the church, took the journal, promising to lock it away, but his eyes held the same haunted look she'd seen in Elias. Clara was still gone, her fate unknown, alive, dead, or something else. Caught in the mirror's reflection, Margaret returned home, the photograph of Anna still in her pocket, a reminder of Elias's loss and her own. The new moon passed, but the silence was no victory. It was a pause, a moment before the cycle could begin again. The church's demolition was scheduled, but Margaret knew it wouldn't erase the threshold. The Watchers, or whatever they were part of Millhaven now, woven into its history, its land, its people, and as she looked out her window at the church's dark silhouette, she wondered if the mirror would ever truly close, or if it was waiting for the next soul to gaze into it. As February 1995 faded into the gray haze of a lingering winter, Millhaven stood at a crossroads, its streets quiet but its soul restless. The church, a husk of its former sanctity, awaited demolition, its shattered steeple a testament to a mystery that had torn the town apart. The silence that had replaced the hum was no solace. It was a shadow, a reminder of the threshold that had been opened and never fully closed. Margaret Ellis, forever changed by Father Hargrove's journal and the vision in the church basement, carried the weight of a truth that defied explanation. The Watchers, born from the mirror of human fear and devotion, were not gone but waiting, woven into the fabric of Millhaven's history. The story of Clara Voss, Father Hargrove, and the Order of the Silent Veil was not just a tale of loss, it was a warning, a glimpse into the fragility of the human mind, and the dangers of gazing too long into the unknown. You who have followed this dark journey to its end have seen what few dare to face. You've walked through the shadows of Millhaven, and what you've uncovered will linger long after the screen fades to black. This story began with a priest's terrified eyes and a church that held secrets older than the town itself. It wove through Clara's disappearance, the cryptic journal, the symbols that pulsed with unnatural life, and Elias Kane's haunted pursuit of a truth tied to his own past. Each step revealed a layer of the mystery, peeling back the veneer of faith to expose a reality where belief could become a mirror, reflecting not just hope, but the darkest corners of the soul. The Watchers, whether entities, echoes, or projections, were not the true horror. The horror was in us in the way our fears, our guilt, our longing for meaning could take shape, could whisper back, could demand to be seen. Millhaven's tragedy was not just the loss of Clara and Hargrove, but the realization that the threshold they crossed was one we all carry within. What does it mean to face the inexplicable? To stand in a church, a place of refuge, and feel the ground beneath you hum with something ancient, something that knows you better than you know yourself? This story asks questions that have no easy answers. What drove Clara to offer herself to the unknown? Why did Hargrove, a man of faith, succumb to terror? And what of Elias, chasing a shadow that mirrored his own loss? Perhaps the most unsettling question is the one you now hold. Could you, in a moment of doubt or desperation, open that same mirror? The symbols, the chants, the hum, they are not confined to Millhaven. They are echoes of a human need to understand, to connect, to believe, even when that belief leads to places we cannot return from. You've reached the end of this journey, and for that you are part of a rare group, those who dare to look where others turn away, who seek the truth behind the shadows. You've seen how faith can twist into fear, how devotion can become a door to something vast and unknowable. Take a moment to feel the weight of what you've uncovered, the way it shifts your perspective on the fragility of the mind, the unpredictability of belief, the thin line between the sacred and the sinister. This story isn't just about Millhaven. It's about the human condition, about the secrets we bury and the mirrors we avoid. You've faced it, and that makes you part of a community bound by curiosity and courage, seekers of the hidden truths that others fear to name. Now we invite you to carry this story forward. In the comments below, share the phrase, "This story changed my way of seeing the human mind." By doing so, you mark yourself as one of the committed, one who has peered into the mirror and survived. Your words will connect you with others who feel the same pull, who want to unravel the mysteries that lie just beyond our grasp. Sharing this video is more than a gesture. It's a way to shine a light into the dark corners of the world, to ensure that stories like Millhaven's are not forgotten. Let others know what lies beneath the surface, what waits in the silence of a small town's church. Picture a web, its strands stretching across time, from the Order of the Silent Veil to Clara's dreams, from Hargrove's journal to the symbols that still linger in Millhaven's frost. By subscribing to this channel, you become part of that web, a thread in a tapestry of seekers who chase the inexplicable, who refuse to let the unknown stay buried. Each video is a step deeper into the shadows, a chance to uncover what no one dares to tell. Keep your curiosity alive, let it burn like a candle in the dark, guiding you through the mysteries that await. Thank you for being here, for daring to look into the mirror. The truth is out there waiting for you to find it.